They'll tell you Houston was built on oil, on cattle, on the sweat of pioneers who carved a city from the swamp. But that's the story for tourists. The truth is uglier, older, and far more dangerous to know. It begins in 1845, before Texas had even fully swallowed the taste of independence. Back then, death wasn't a stranger, it was a neighbor you nodded to on your way to church. And one family in particular, they didn't just nod back. They invited death in, fed him supper, and learned how to make him linger. You've never heard their name because it was scrubbed from records, whispered away in saloon corners, and buried in the kind of graves nobody visits. But I'm going to say it. What? The Calderwoods. And when I say it, I'm not talking about a few bad apples. I'm talking about a bloodline that made murder a craft and turned their funeral home into a feeding ground. Even now, I feel it, like we're knocking on a locked door no one alive has permission to open. And yet, here you are, listening, leaning in, about to hear the truth they built a city on. Houston, 1845, wasn't the sprawling beast it is today. It was a muddy sprawl of shacks, gun smoke, and opportunity, a place where fortunes were made fast and lives ended faster. Disease still chewed through towns, cholera and yellow fever cutting down the rich and poor alike. In that chaos, the Calderwoods thrived. Their funeral home wasn't just a business, it was a sanctuary. The poor could pay with bread, labor, even a goat if it came to it. The rich got marble headstones and poetry carved into oak coffins. But death in Houston had a rhythm, and in that rhythm the Calderwoods learned to play a new song. They weren't waiting for death to knock. They were writing his schedule. And no one suspected a thing. The family were pillars of the community, Sunday churchgoers, patrons of school fundraisers, smiling in daguerreotypes like saints. But behind those smiles was a calculus so cold it makes the hair on your arms stand. I'm telling you, the faces you see in history books aren't always the heroes. Sometimes they're the predators who survived because they wrote the history. The first whisper came from a traveling doctor, a man hired to check the health of Houston's far-flung settlements. He noticed something wrong. Bodies too fresh for the cause of death listed. Bruises in places grief could not explain. A young man found dead in his bed with lungs full of liquid but no fever in his history. The Calderwoods explained it away with practiced ease, an accident here, a hidden illness there. And the doctor, alone in an unfamiliar city with no allies, could only watch as coffin after coffin disappeared into their cemetery's soil. But he kept notes. And those notes, they were dangerous. If anyone had seen them at the time, the Calderwoods would have been hanged in the square by torchlight. Yet no one did. Because those who got close to the truth in 1845 Houston didn't stay close for long. They disappeared, or their bodies ended up on the Calderwoods' own embalming tables. Tell me, do you still want to keep going? Because the next layer we pull back doesn't just reveal murder. It reveals the machinery that kept the murders hidden. And once you see it, you'll never look at history the same way again. There's a reason you've never heard of the Calderwood case. It's not because no one knew, it's because the wrong people knew. In 1845, Houston's power wasn't in the mayor's office or the courthouse. It was in the men who owned the land, the ones who could buy a sheriff's silence for the price of a dinner. And the Calderwoods were tied to them like a snake is tied to its venom. Death, you see, is profitable when you know how to control it. They didn't just bury the dead. They bought the land around the graves. They sold the plots. They made deals with widows to manage estates, all while ensuring those estates were freshly vacated. And when suspicion grew too loud, it was strangled in its crib. A sheriff's investigation halted for lack of evidence, a witness suddenly deciding they must have been mistaken. That's not incompetence. That's coordination. It wasn't just the Calderwoods killing, it was the city keeping their knives clean. And if you think that kind of thing stopped in 1845, you're not paying attention. One of the doctor's notes, the kind no one was supposed to read, described the Calderwoods' funeral home basement in a way that makes my chest tighten even now. Shelves of chemical jars, some filled with clear fluid, and inside human organs. Not preserved for science. Preserved for study. The way a hunter mounts antlers on his wall, the Calderwoods collected death itself. And there was a ledger. Not a list of names for payment, a list of names for experimentation. Young. Sick. healthy. Next to each, a method. Tincture, compression, submersion, like they were perfecting recipes. The doctor didn't understand how deep it went until he realized the pattern. They were testing poisons and techniques on real people to find the most undetectable kill, and then selling those methods to men in power. That's why the sheriff never knocked on their door. That's why certain deaths were never questioned. The Calderwoods weren't a funeral home. They were an invisible arm of control, the kind that kills without trials, without public hangings, without any proof. Just silence. That there's a moment in every story where you realize you're not just talking about the past, you're staring into a mirror. Because halfway through my research, I found the phrase they used among themselves. A phrase meant to bind loyalty and remind them of their power. We choose who sleeps. Chilling, isn't it? And now I'm giving that phrase to you. Comment it twice right now. We choose who sleeps. So I know you've crossed the threshold with me. So I know you're not just listening, you're seeing. This is more than a story. This is an autopsy on the lies we're fed about history. And the deeper we go, the more you'll understand why they erased these names from every record they could find. Because the Calderwood story doesn't end in 1845. It mutates. It survives. And the next time you walk past an old cemetery, you might start to wonder how many of those graves were dug by death, and how many were dug by design. The night that nearly undid them began like any other humid Houston evening. Crickets screaming in the dark, oil lamps casting halos against clapboard walls. The Calderwoods had just finished a burial for a merchant's wife when a knock came at their door. It wasn't a grieving family. It was a man in a dark coat, dripping from the sudden rain, carrying no lantern. His voice was steady, but his eyes flickered with something colder than fear. "You've been careless," he said. No greeting. No introduction. Just that. Inside the parlor, Josiah tightened his grip on the doorframe. Martha appeared behind him, her smile slow to form. The stranger placed a folded paper on the embalming table, droplets staining its edges. On it, the names of 3 people who had died in the last month. Beside each name, the exact cause of death. All correct. All unnatural. The Calderwoods didn't ask who he was. They didn't have to. In Houston, men like that didn't exist in the open. They were messages wearing skin. And the message was clear. Someone higher than the Calderwoods had been watching. Someone who could end them, or use them. That someone was Daniel Kavanaugh, a railroad investor with enough money to erase entire neighborhoods if they got in his way. Kavanaugh understood the value of the Calderwoods' work, but he also understood risk. He didn't threaten them. He offered a contract. "Your skills," he said, "are wasted on widows and vagrants. I have specific needs." And with that, the Calderwoods were pulled into a different kind of killing, not for curiosity, not for practice, but for strategy. Kavanaugh's enemies began to vanish. Rival investors, stubborn landowners, witnesses in court cases, all dying from ailments that couldn't be traced. In exchange, the Calderwoods got protection so tight even the doctor who suspected them couldn't get a word past the city's gatekeepers. And here's where the machinery revealed itself. The Calderwoods were no longer just predators. They were a weapon in a larger war for power. The deaths became precise, time, political. And every funeral brought more silence to the people who might have stood against the men running Houston. But power breeds arrogance. And arrogance creates cracks. The crack appeared when a target wasn't who Kavanaugh claimed. A young woman, barely 20, healthy, sharp-witted, and newly married to a man Kavanaugh swore had stolen from him. She wasn't the target, she was bait. Her husband had left the city on business. Killing her would bring him back in a fury, where Kavanaugh's men could deal with him. But something happened the Calderwoods hadn't planned for. She fought. In the middle of the embalming room, Rebecca Calderwood, barely 22 herself, found the girl clawing, biting, knocking over jars of arsenic. By the time they subdued her, she had seen the ledger. She had seen the wall of preserved organs. And she had screamed so loud the neighbors came to the door. The Calderwoods talked their way out, said she'd gone mad from grief, claimed she'd been poisoned by bad bread before she even arrived. But the damage was done. For the first time in years, eyes in Houston turned toward the funeral home, and the Calderwoods felt the ground shift under their feet. Dr. Thompson had been silent for weeks. He carried the ledger in a satchel beneath his coat, each name a promise of the truth, each page a weight that threatened to crush him. He knew what he had to do: show the authorities, spark outrage, bring justice. But Houston's courts were corruptible. The mayor's office, the sheriff's deputies, even the local physicians, most had taken favors from the Calderwoods over the years, whether it was discounted services, gold coins, or just fear of the wrong kind of gossip. Thompson wasn't naive. He understood that to expose them he had to go public in a way no one could ignore. So he wrote letters to newspapers, prepared detailed reports, even sketched diagrams of the embalming basement, all the while walking the streets as if he were invisible, praying that the Calderwoods wouldn't know his every move. And that's when the first threat arrived. A note slid beneath his door at the boarding house, written in a hand so delicate it seemed almost maternal. "Some doors," it said, "should never be opened. Some knowledge is a knife you will turn on yourself." Thompson knew immediately. The Calderwoods had been watching him all along. Every move, every stop, every meeting had been recorded. The family had eyes everywhere. Young boys running errands, girls sent to visit townsfolk to gather gossip. Even Martha herself attending church services to observe who asked questions, who lingered, who might pry too deep. The psychological control was absolute. And it wasn't just fear. It was disorientation. Thompson began doubting his own memory, wondering if the ledger had been forged, if his observations were hallucinations. The Calderwoods didn't just kill bodies. They killed certainty. They corrupted trust itself. By the time Thompson realized the extent of their reach, he had already stepped into the trap. That trap was simple and brilliant. A social engagement, a gala thrown by one of Houston's wealthiest families, who also happened to owe the Calderwoods a favor. Thompson received a personal invitation, addressed elegantly, promising support for his cause. He arrived, ledger in hand, ready to reveal everything. But the room smelled of betrayal. Faces smiled, hands shook, and whispers flowed like poison in the air. A servant accidentally spilled wine on the ledger, and Thompson froze, desperate to save the evidence. Before he could react, a hand rested lightly on his shoulder, Josiah's hand, cold and patient. "Sometimes," Josiah said, lips barely moving, "truth is more dangerous than lies." Thompson left that night, ledger soggy, courage dampened, realizing for the first time that the Calderwoods weren't just killers. They were predators who had learned how to trap the mind itself. Fear wasn't their weapon, certainty was. The Calderwoods weren't a family in the normal sense. They were a machine, each member a meticulously tuned cog in a system designed to control death, and the minds of everyone who dared approach it. Ezekiel, the patriarch, was the architect. Calm, calculating, a man whose eyes seemed to measure the weight of a soul before you even spoke. Martha, his wife, was the recruiter, the subtle manipulator, a master of appearances and empathy turned weapon. The children were trained apprentices, indoctrinated from birth into a code that blurred morality, legality, and humanity itself. Josiah learned methodical precision, how to stage a death so convincingly that the authorities would never question it. Caleb mastered logistics and concealment, orchestrating the movement of bodies, chemicals, and evidence. Rebecca, with her innocent face and soft voice, became the family's eyes in society, spotting vulnerabilities, gathering secrets, reporting back without suspicion. This wasn't just a family business. It was a full-scale psychological operation, designed to protect itself while bending an entire town into silence. The doctor had begun to notice patterns, subtle but undeniable. Every death linked to the Calderwoods shared a rhythm, a signature. Bruises appeared in the same places, poisons were administered in similar ways, and coffins always carried subtle modifications. Hidden compartments, reinforced lids, even traces of chemicals that suggested experimentation. It was more than murder. It was a study of control. They observed reactions, refined techniques, and cataloged human behavior with the meticulousness of scientists. And worse, they understood fear. Not just how it felt, but how it spread, how it could be weaponized to manipulate communities. People didn't need to see the crime to obey it. They only needed to feel its invisible hand in the marketplace, in the church pew, in whispers around candlelight. And in this psychological web, the Calderwoods were untouchable. One night, the doctor found himself wandering near the funeral home, trying to piece together the enormity of what he had uncovered. From the shadows, he glimpsed a window on the second floor. There, Rebecca Calderwood was not sewing or reading. She was practicing, a simulation of one of their killings, every move precise, every gesture rehearsed. He realized in that instant that these weren't isolated crimes. They were drills, training exercises, methods passed down and perfected over decades. And when the doctor realized that Martha was watching him from another window, smiling faintly as if reading his thoughts, he understood the truth he had tried to ignore. This family didn't just kill bodies. They killed confidence, curiosity, and courage itself. To defy them was to step into a carefully constructed labyrinth where the walls themselves seemed to whisper lies, doubt, and fear. The Calderwoods weren't only running a funeral home, they were running a psychological empire of death. The ledger was more than paper, it was a roadmap of horror. Each entry detailed the victim's habits, vulnerabilities, and the calculated method of their end. Names, dates, times, meticulous notes on how to manipulate their final hours. One entry described a wealthy widow who had been encouraged to consume tea laced with belladonna while discussing the sale of her estate. Another detailed a farmer who had been made to believe a minor injury was fatal, coaxed into his own coffin with promises of care, only to find death waiting at the final moment. Reading the ledger was like peering into the mind of a predator so precise that the act of murder became a ritual, a choreography perfected across decades. And the Calderwoods weren't satisfied with mere death. They measured reactions, fear, even the way the community processed grief, recording patterns to refine their technique. One particularly disturbing aspect was how the family blurred love and cruelty. Rebecca, the youngest, wrote in her own hand, documenting how to calm victims with affection before the final act. A smile, a kind word, then the needle, she wrote. Every gesture was part of the illusion, nurturing, benign, caring, all leading to the same inescapable outcome. The family understood the human need for trust, for empathy, and weaponized it against each person who crossed their threshold. Those who should have suspected, those who might have resisted, were softened with gestures of kindness, only to be swallowed by the inevitability of their control. The Calderwoods' brilliance was in this duality. They appeared as caretakers as the town's benevolent presence, while orchestrating calculated annihilation behind closed doors. The escalation was relentless. What began with opportunistic murders of the isolated and elderly evolved into a precise system that reached into every corner of Houston. The doctor realized that even those who had no reason to fear them, merchants, politicians, church elders, were subtly influenced by the family's social presence. Their charity, generosity, and carefully orchestrated reputation acted like a psychological virus, embedding compliance and fear in every interaction. And when someone started asking questions, the Calderwoods did not hesitate. They could neutralize a threat without leaving a trace. Threats were subtle, delivered in whispers, gestures, or a visit that seemed benign but left the recipient shaken, wondering if their mind had betrayed them. The city was theirs not because of wealth or guns, but because they had perfected control over perception itself. The dead were merely the proof of the unseen power. Dr. Thompson wasn't passive. He had begun compiling evidence outside Houston, sending letters to distant newspapers, copying ledger pages in code, and meeting allies in secret. But every attempt to act felt like walking a tightrope over a pit of vipers. The Calderwoods sensed resistance before it even surfaced. Martha, with her uncanny intuition, would appear in his neighborhood under the guise of a social visit, asking subtle questions that left him second-guessing himself. Josiah would patrol the streets at night, ostensibly on errands, ensuring the patterns of Thompson's movement were noted. And Caleb, the quiet observer, had eyes in places the doctor didn't even think to check. A friend at the tavern, a clerk at the post office, someone to overhear whispered conversations. Each action Thompson took only tightened the invisible leash around his mind. And yet, even in fear, he refused to stop. The cracks in the Calderwoods' operation were invisible to the town but glaring to those who knew what to see. Rebecca, the youngest, began to question the morality of the acts, noting inconsistencies in her mother's manipulations and her father's cold calculations. Josiah, always precise, grew restless with Kavanaugh's escalating demands. The targets were no longer isolated or vulnerable. Now, powerful men with connections began dying, and with each successful operation came the faintest trace of doubt. Even a machine can misfire, and the human components, fear, loyalty, love, curiosity, began to show. The ledger, once a source of control, became a mirror of their obsession, reflecting not just methods but the psychological toll on the family itself. What had started as mastery over death was becoming an internal battlefield of conscience and ambition. The doctor saw an opportunity. He realized that the Calderwoods were not invincible, that their human weaknesses could be exploited. If he could destabilize the family internally, perhaps they would expose themselves. He began planting rumors, subtle insinuations that the ledger might be compromised, that one of the children might betray another, that Martha's influence could be turned against Ezekiel. And it worked just barely. Arguments erupted behind closed doors, whispers of distrust spread in hushed tones, and the unbreakable family facade began to show hairline fractures. The Calderwoods, masters of fear and manipulation, had underestimated one man's determination. And as Thompson moved closer to exposing them publicly, the sense of dread in Houston grew tangible. Death was no longer only a tool, it had become a warning, for the city, for the family, and for anyone who dared to pierce the shadows. Paranoia is a subtle killer, more potent than poison or blade. In the Calderwood household, it began creeping in like smoke through cracks. Martha would glance at Josiah with suspicion, noting his lingering looks at Rebecca. Ezekiel started questioning Caleb's silence, reading hidden meanings into every word. Even Rebecca, young and innocent, began to tremble under the weight of unspoken accusations. The ledger, once a source of unshakable control, now became a symbol of vulnerability. Every name written within it reminded them not of mastery, but of exposure. And as the family grew increasingly insular, their behavior began to spill over into public view. Neighbors noticed nervous glances, doors left unlocked or slammed too hard, and whispers of odd deliveries arriving at odd hours. The community, long accustomed to the Calderwoods' seemingly benign presence, began to feel unease, a subtle, creeping anxiety they couldn't quite name. It was a single misstep, a small mistake that would begin the unraveling. Caleb, tasked with discreetly transporting chemical supplies, misjudged the timing of a delivery. A young boy, delivering groceries for his mother, witnessed a jar labeled aconite slip from Caleb's hands and shatter on the cobblestone street. Panic flashed in Caleb's eyes, and he offered the boy a bribe, a gift of coins and an empty smile, to keep silent. But the boy ran home, trembling, and told his father. Rumors began to fester in the community like weeds, spreading faster than the family's careful plots of secrecy. The Calderwoods' first crack in public perception had appeared, small and almost laughable if it weren't tied to murder itself. Their meticulous system of psychological domination and fear had finally allowed a sliver of daylight in. The doctor knew this misstep was his opening. He began orchestrating subtle pressure from multiple directions, whispering to townsfolk, planting letters with anonymous accusations, feeding rumors that the Calderwoods' influence extended far beyond their funeral home. The family responded with a calculated fury. Josiah increased night patrols, Martha visited suspected witnesses under the guise of charity, and Ezekiel imposed strict schedules to monitor every movement of their household. But every action, every attempt to suppress suspicion, only highlighted their desperation. Fear is contagious, and now it was spreading outward. The community, once trusting, began noticing patterns in deaths, the too-perfect timing of funerals, the unnerving precision of care. Death itself was no longer invisible, it had become a question mark. And in that question, the Calderwoods' empire, carefully built on secrecy and obedience, began to feel the tremors of collapse. Inside the Calderwood parlor, the air grew thick with tension. Ezekiel's once calm eyes now flickered with suspicion. Martha moved silently through the hallways, counting glances, tracking footsteps, anticipating threats she could not fully see. Josiah and Caleb argued in hushed tones, debating how to handle the growing suspicion among townsfolk, the whispers that now reached ears they had not intended. Rebecca, still young but painfully aware, began noticing patterns in her family's behavior, the fleeting touches of panic, the overlong silences, the deliberate misdirections in conversation. The family, a machine once perfect in its function, was beginning to malfunction. Every member sensed that something they could not control was approaching. And the ledger, the very heart of their power, became a source of dread rather than control. The pages were no longer instructions but chains binding them to a future they could not escape. Dr. Thompson, emboldened by the boy's story and the town's growing unease, began setting traps of his own. He engaged neighbors in subtle questioning, planting seeds of doubt without revealing his hand. "Have you noticed," he would ask casually, "how quickly Mr. Calderwood arranges funerals? Or how Mrs. Calderwood seems to know things about the sick before anyone else?" These casual inquiries spread like wildfire. Soon, the community began noticing irregularities in death certificates, odd timing in burials, and the too perfect care offered to grieving families. The Calderwoods had always controlled perception, but perception was slipping. Fear, once theirs alone, began to swirl outside their walls, creating an invisible net of pressure that tightened with each passing day. The first confrontation came quietly, almost imperceptibly. At a town meeting, an elderly widow questioned the speed of a recent burial. A shopkeeper, emboldened by rumors, whispered about a strange illness that had claimed his neighbor. Ezekiel, Martha, and their children attended, smiles polite but teeth clenched, absorbing every word as though it were a weapon. Josiah's hand trembled slightly when he poured tea for the attendees, Caleb shifted restlessly, and Rebecca's eyes darted between familiar faces now tinged with suspicion. The doctor, seated among them, watched silently, recognizing that the tide had shifted. For the first time, the Calderwoods were reacting, defensive, vulnerable. And in that subtle vulnerability lay an opening. Death had been their tool, their language, their power. But now it might be the signal of their undoing. The first tangible evidence arrived almost by accident. A local carpenter, hired to repair a fence behind the Calderwood funeral home, discovered a trapdoor partially hidden beneath years of dust and floorboards. Curiosity overpowered caution, and he lifted it, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air that rose was heavy, metallic, and strangely sweet. He stumbled upon shelves lined with glass jars, some containing preserved organs, others marked with dates and initials he did not recognize. There were surgical tools too precise for ordinary use, and the faint smell of chemicals that made his stomach churn. He recoiled and fled, but the discovery set off a chain reaction. The news of the hidden basement, though incomplete, reached Dr. Thompson, who realized that the Calderwoods' carefully concealed empire of death had a tangible, physical heart. Armed with this knowledge, Thompson moved with calculated precision. He enlisted the help of a few trusted townsfolk who had begun to feel unease, sharing carefully chosen details and instructing them to watch, to observe patterns, to record irregularities in daily life. Soon the pieces began to form a coherent picture. Coffins arriving before expected funerals, chemical deliveries at odd hours, and the eerie consistency in the appearance of bruises and puncture marks all pointed to the same conclusion. A systematic, premeditated network of murder hidden behind the veneer of respectability. The Calderwoods' brilliance had always been in making murder seem ordinary, inevitable, even charitable. And now, with every observation logged, the townsfolk began to see what Thompson already knew. This family's power was not in brute force but in their ability to manipulate reality itself. The Calderwoods, sensing the pressure, escalated their own measures. Martha began sending letters, veiled threats written with honeyed words, to anyone who dared ask questions. Josiah patrolled the streets with an ever-watchful eye, while Caleb prepared escape routes and contingency plans for their darkest secrets. Rebecca, once the innocent observer, now became a messenger of fear, her eyes sharp and calculating, gathering intelligence on the town's shifting allegiances. And yet, even as they tightened their grip, cracks widened. People whispered in corners, looked at one another with suspicion, and hesitated before accepting favors. The doctor knew the crescendo was approaching. The Calderwoods' empire, perfect for decades, was beginning to implode under the weight of their own audacity and the relentless observation of those who had finally begun to see. The confrontation came one fog-drenched evening at the edge of town. A small crowd had gathered under the pretense of a community meeting, but the tension in the air was palpable. Dr. Thompson stepped forward, presenting subtle yet undeniable evidence. Inconsistencies in death records, eyewitness accounts of suspicious deliveries, and the rumor of a hidden basement filled with horrors. Ezekiel's calm veneer cracked for a fleeting moment. Martha's smile remained, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of panic. Josiah's fists clenched at his sides while Caleb paced silently, calculating every possible countermeasure. The townsfolk, previously lulled by years of trust and the Calderwoods' apparent benevolence, felt the first stirrings of fear in a different direction, fear of the truth. And as whispers swelled into questions, the family's command over perception wavered, revealing the first glimpse of their vulnerability to the public. The ledger, the source of the family's methodical terror, was now under scrutiny. Thompson had acquired fragments through careful copying, and the townsfolk began piecing together patterns that had once been invisible. The entries revealed not just names and methods, but a hierarchy of control: who orchestrated which deaths, who delivered poisons, who manipulated grief, who observed reactions. Each revelation was a dagger, cutting deeper into the town's sense of safety, and more importantly, into the Calderwoods' psychological armor. Rumors turned into speculation, speculation into accusation, and accusation began to fracture the family's carefully maintained public identity. People started avoiding the parlor, questioning every interaction, and noticing the eerie efficiency with which the Calderwoods managed each death. The empire of fear they had constructed was now reflected back at them, jagged and sharp. As the pressure mounted, the Calderwoods' internal discord escalated. Rebecca, for the first time, openly questioned her mother and father, challenging the morality of their actions and expressing doubt about the wisdom of their secrecy. Josiah and Caleb bickered over how to contain the growing scrutiny, debating strategies that now seemed insufficient. Martha, once untouchable in her manipulation, found herself second-guessing subtle threats and carefully crafted smiles. Ezekiel, patriarch and strategist, realized that control had slipped through his fingers like sand. Each effort to regain dominance only revealed cracks to the outside world. And in the background, Dr. Thompson watched, understanding that the tipping point was near. Fear, once their weapon, now encircled the Calderwoods, threatening to expose the full scale of their terror. The town, the doctor, and even the family themselves were now locked in a psychological spiral that none could escape. Desperation is a dangerous companion, and the Calderwoods embraced it fully. Ezekiel, realizing their web of control was unraveling, orchestrated a bold move, a staged illness of a wealthy patron to lure him into their home. Josiah prepared the poison, Martha refined the social manipulation, Caleb arranged the scene, and Rebecca observed, learning to anticipate every reaction. But something went wrong. A neighbor had been tipped off by Dr. Thompson's subtle warning and arrived at the house just as the plan was about to unfold. The family's perfect choreography faltered. Josiah's hands shook under pressure, Martha's voice wavered, Caleb's contingency routes were useless, and Rebecca's calculations misfired. Fear, long a weapon for them, now gripped their own hearts. And in that faltering moment, the first tangible glimpse of their true nature was exposed to someone outside the family. The community began to grasp the magnitude of what they were dealing with. Whispered accounts from neighbors spoke of strange visits, late-night meetings, and unusual illnesses among those who had interacted with the Calderwoods. Even subtle behaviors, a too-long glance, a hand on a shoulder that lingered unnervingly, became pieces of a growing puzzle. Dr. Thompson capitalized on this unease, guiding townsfolk to observe patterns, ask questions, and connect dots that had long been invisible. People began to notice that those who had seemingly died of natural causes shared a common thread. The Calderwoods had been present in some form before their death. The realization was terrifying, not just because of the murders, but because it implied a level of cunning and psychological mastery that made the family untouchable, until now. Pressure from the outside world began to manifest internally. Martha and Ezekiel argued violently behind closed doors, each blaming the other for missteps and the growing exposure. Josiah, who had long considered himself untouchable in his precision, grew reckless, making small errors in timing and secrecy. Caleb, silent and calculating, began to withdraw, sensing the impending collapse. And Rebekah, standing on the edge of youth and knowledge, began subtly defying instructions, leaving traces of evidence and clues that would later guide investigators. The family's once impenetrable structure of fear, secrecy, and manipulation was crumbling under the dual weight of internal discord and external scrutiny. Death had been their domain, their power, their language. But as the walls of control cracked, the very thing that had kept them dominant now threatened to become the instrument of their undoing. The breaking point arrived quietly, in the dead of a moonless night. Dr. Thompson, armed with witness accounts, copies of the ledger, and undeniable evidence from the basement, confronted the Calderwoods in their own home. The air was thick with the smell of chemicals and decay, the remnants of a family's obsession with death. Ezekiel tried to assert control. Martha wielded her honeyed words like daggers. Josiah clenched his fists in readiness, and Caleb's calmness masked a storm beneath. But Thompson had meticulously prepared. He spoke with authority, weaving the evidence together with a clarity that left the family unable to hide behind their usual smokescreens. Panic rippled through them. The empire of fear they had cultivated for decades was collapsing in real time. The townsfolk arrived soon after, guided by the doctor's discreet calls and warnings. What they saw would haunt them forever. The hidden basement, shelves lined with organs, vials of poison, surgical instruments far beyond necessity, and the leather-bound ledger documenting decades of calculated murders. Gasps and screams filled the space, shattering the once suffocating control of the Calderwoods. Even Rebekah, standing at the edge of the chaos, realized that she had been complicit in a system that preyed on the vulnerable, yet also sensed a strange liberation in witnessing the exposure of the truth. For the first time, fear was no longer theirs to wield. It belonged to the very people they had tormented, and it cut deeper than any poison or blade ever could. In the aftermath, the Calderwoods were arrested, interrogated, and forced to confront the enormity of their actions. The town struggled to process the horror, grappling with the betrayal of trust and the depth of human darkness that had existed in plain sight. Dr. Thompson, forever changed, understood that evil was not always loud or chaotic. Sometimes, it was meticulously quiet, operating under the guise of benevolence. The ledger became evidence, the hidden laboratory a chilling testament to the psychology of control, and the town learned that the human capacity for manipulation and cruelty could be both systematic and terrifyingly precise. And somewhere in the shadows, the echoes of the Calderwoods' calculated mastery of death lingered, a reminder that secrets, once buried, always have a way of surfacing. Years later, the story of the Calderwood family became legend. Whispered warnings, cautionary tales, a dark chapter in Houston's history. Those who delved into the archives, the journals, or the old newspaper clippings could feel the weight of the psychological grip they held over a community. And for those who dare to study the mechanisms of fear, control, and obsession, the Calderwoods offer a blueprint. How human ingenuity can be twisted into something monstrous, how family loyalty can mask horror, and how even the most respected individuals can harbor a darkness no one ever suspects. Remember, knowledge is power, but some truths are dangerous. If you feel the pull of this story, comment twice below the phrase, "I see the shadows." A lock-in for those who dare to confront hidden darkness. And if you want to explore more forbidden histories and truths that were never meant to be uncovered, subscribe to the channel now, because the deeper you go, the darker the rabbit hole becomes.